Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for coming. We're here to talk about open source and open source security in particular. Some of you may remember this year there was the XZ utils backdoor, which got a lot of headlines and was a pretty big story. In the last 10 years, there's been a few of them, Log4j, Heartbleed, etc. We may touch on them, but I'm really excited to have all these great folks on stage today. They all come from like slightly different backgrounds. They all know a lot about open source though. So yeah, let's get it started. I wanted to start with Aeva. You have worked on open source for like 25 years in different roles. You were a developer, you worked in open source projects inside big tech companies, and now you work at the government. What keeps you up at night about the state of open source today?
So many things, unfortunately, but mostly it's the lack of awareness of what made open source trustworthy 10, 20 years ago. So many folks are using it today without knowing that history, and they're just grabbing stuff off the internet and putting it in production without paying it the attention it needs, securely consuming it, or contributing back to make sure it stays usable. And that imbalance, we're heading towards a cliff. Too many people consuming it without helping to sustain it.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think people are doing that, like consuming without realizing what they're doing?
It's cheaper, right? They think it's free. To the title of the talk, right? I like to say open source is not free like pizza, it's free like a puppy. You take it home and don't feed it, it's going to eat your furniture, your shoes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you think?
If I may chime in, it's not only that it's free, but it's so foundational. And honestly, in so many areas, you don't have many other choices. Like if you're going to run an operating system, you basically have two choices. You have Windows, you have Linux, and this is true across like the entire software stack. And so, yes, like open source is free as a big motivation, but also I find that in many areas, it is the only choice or one of the few, like, reasonable choices. And it's not that people are not sensitized to potential vulnerabilities or baggage and potential negative externalities that come with using open source, but it's just the reality of software development these days. Open source has become the lifeblood of software, and it's everywhere. It's, by some estimates, like 95 to 98% of all software running is open source. So it's just so foundational and baked into everything everything out there.
Yeah. What do you think, Luis? What are you?
I mean, to some extent, it's the power of defaults. We all sort of take for granted. I think we as a culture, I mean, almost, this is going to sound sort of grandiose, but almost as a civilization, we have a habit of thinking about infrastructure as something that's just there. Of course we have highways that work. Of course we have bridges that work. And so, of course, we can just type npm install and like get a huge stack of stuff. And that's not necessarily bad. I mean, it's immensely powerful for all of society, but it does mean that there's a little bit of like, we don't think too much about the man behind the curtain, right? Of course, somebody's taking care of the highways. Of course, somebody's taking care of the open source. And can I make sure I grimace at the entire audience all at once that, yeah, it turns out actually we're not doing a great job necessarily taking care of the open source.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, you are from Tidelift. Can you tell us a little bit about what you all do and what's your business model for helping open source?
Yeah, so the founding team at Tidelift, including myself, have all been involved in open source since the late 90s, which seems like an awful long time ago now. And we have observed that there's a lot of activity sort of at the top of the stack and at the bottom of the stack, right? Linux, arguably the best supported software project in all of history in a lot of ways. Lots of things up at the top, are represented here at this conference. But then there's a huge number of packages in between, and that we all use, that we all rely on every day, but we don't necessarily know actually what's going on there. So Tidelift was formed on the idea that we can provide to developers and to enterprises better metadata, better information about that. And in exchange for that money, right, we turn around and work directly with the developers. We compensate them. We use this magical new technology called capitalism to get them on board with doing some of this really basic stuff, right? Because these are people who are doing open source because they care, because they're passionate about it, but those are batteries that run dry, right? You get a new puppy, and an actual puppy, not a software puppy. You get an actual puppy, and it turns out like, oh, your time for fixing that CVE is a little reduced. And so we pay developers to actually make that happen, and we have pretty good results from it.
Bogomil, you also commit acts of capitalism at Sequoia. And,
So in the name of the firm.
Yeah. And you know, you're a cybersecurity expert, invested in a bunch of security companies. What's your perspective on that, like on the business model that Tidelift takes and that some of your companies take?
It's the whole. I find it actually a bit ironic that we're talking about open source and security today, and security being a significant concern for open source, because the very origin of open source was precisely to produce more secure software, or at least that was like one of the big motivations of the movement, like back in the days. And as it often happens with new and disruptive technology movements, you end up solving one set of problems and you create a whole new set of problems. And this is the story of open source, that it has taken a life of its own and has snowballed, and now it's so big and it's everywhere that all of a sudden we have woken up to the realization that there aren't any obvious pervasive mechanisms to secure open source. And I think all of it honestly goes back to the fact that the business model for open source is still very much work in progress. And I think, to me, those two things are indelible. Like, security for open source and business model and sustainability for open source are very tightly related, because let's not be naive. Securing open source software takes resources, takes time, and also takes expertise. Those are the two things that are necessary, like, to make progress in securing open source. And if you think about the totality of open source out there, yes, there is the tip of the iceberg of open source projects that lend themselves to giving birth to companies and being commercialized by companies. And at Sequoia, we have had the good fortune of being partners with some of the most prominent open source companies like MongoDB and Temporal and Confluent, with Kafka and others. But this again is like the tip of the iceberg, and there's like so many other open source projects that, for many reasons, just aren't eligible or will not result necessarily like into businesses. And I think this is where like the huge blind spot is. This is like the big invisible sort of mountain. But again, to me, those topics are kind of like the two sides of the same coin of sustainable business model and securing software. And what Tidelift is doing is obviously like very, very important, and it's one of the ways like to achieve better open source security. Having said that, in the world of security, every practitioner knows that you need defense in depth. Unfortunately, there aren't any silver bullets. There isn't like a one way like to guarantee like security, and so you need to layer multiple layers of defense. And I think this is what needs to happen in the world of open source software security, that you need multiple different mechanisms, you need multiple attempts, you need multiple ways to collectively make progress. And Tidelift is a great example of one layer of defense, if you want. And there are other kind of innovative models. I happen to work with a company called ChainGuard, which in some ways you can call it like patching as a service. They take upon themselves like, to fix CVEs, at least in container infrastructure, and provide golden hardened images. That's another example of kind of, making progress, but I think we need multiple of these different approaches.
Eva, I think you had something.
Yeah, you touched on several things that I'm sort of trying to advance. There are some missing technologies or missing capabilities at large in the ecosystem, even if they exist in small pockets. One is how to assess the trustworthiness of a project. We have scanning tools, we have SBOMs, but there are some things that still remain to be built in that space. Analyzing not just is the code itself safe, but how was the code developed? To your comment about, in the early days, open source was a response to security. The old adage, how to go, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Mm-hmm. The inverse, given too few eyes, all software contains bugs. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think we should all be doing as consumers of open source is ensuring that we understand the development process behind the open source we're consuming. Was it actively peer reviewed? Not just did you run a static analysis tester after you download it from the internet, but how is it being maintained? Are there people there who are going to respond? Right? If you find a bug, are you able to fix it yourself, or do you have a relationship with folks who can fix it? That's a key missing piece that a lot of companies are just downloading and not paying attention to their supply chain. The other missing piece, I think, is we're still labeling software the way we labeled punch card decks. Like, it sounds ridiculous when I say it. But there's a couple efforts out there, Git as a version control system, trying to apply the same kind of technology Merkle tree is, or more accurate software identifiers to understand the supply chain, or to sign the components in a build pipeline. And ChainGuard's doing some work on that kind of stuff as well. I think these are promising technological solutions to catch up to the state of affairs today.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree about the defense in depth point. The only thing I'd add to that is that it is somewhat depressing how many, when you look hard at the problem, how many low-hanging fruit, and this is something that CISA has been working a lot on hammering home the point that there are, in fact, quite a few fairly simple, basic things that can be done if there's time and energy. And that's, I think, one of the tensions in the current moment is, on the one hand, it's great that we're getting government attention because this is as has been pointed out, right, this is now a national security concern. The good news is open source has been so successful that we have White House conferences about it. The bad news is we have White House conferences for some very scary reasons, right?
Yes.
And that kind of attention is going to bring pressure on open source that I don't think our communities, and certainly not our solo maintainers, because I think one thing, if I could drive home just a single fact, right, the kinds of open source projects that are represented here, things like Mongo, like ChainGuard, like the Linux kernel, those are in many senses outliers. Mm-hmm. The median number of people who work on an open source software project that your company consumes is 1. It has always been 1. We have some data that suggests that maybe someday soon it will be 2, right? But these projects with hundreds or thousands of paid developers are very much outliers, and yet all of those pieces in the middle are vulnerabilities, or vulnerabilities waiting to happen, which is not an indictment of those people. Those people are awesome. We should all thank them whenever we meet them. But at the same time, that's our reality.
I couldn't agree more that open source basically follows this parallel dynamic where we have a small number of very prominent projects and then a very, very, very long tail of projects that basically have, the solo maintainer. And I think it's also a matter of a skill gap because, you have thousands and thousands of creators and maintainers of open source that honestly, first and foremost, obsess with the functionality of what they're building. And, some of them have like deep security expertise, but let's face it, majority do not necessarily. And so I think there is a significant skill gap, which is also an opportunity, for example, for potentially like an open source framework that would make it easier for these solo maintainers and open source developers to do the right thing. And again, I find it like very interesting that in the world of open source, we don't yet have like, some of the very basic hygiene of a software development lifecycle, like what you mentioned, like a code review.
So a couple things that CISA just published about that. I think it was earlier this week or last week, we published a product security or a product safety bad practices guide. It has a whole section on open source. If you're using open source to build a product, here's a set of a couple things you really shouldn't do. And we've seen some uptick in open source development foundations adopting the NIST Secure Software Development Framework as, exactly as you say, a guideline for how to securely do development of these projects, and then share the artifacts, the demonstration that they followed those best practices to everyone downstream from them. So it's possible, but the uptick is slow and it's asymmetrical. All the single developer projects, I agree, that's a much harder problem because these are volunteers doing it in their spare time.
Yeah. Though, I mean, I would add, some of it is, again, some of the frustrating, the broad scale of problems that we're facing here. There are some really sophisticated skills gap kind of issues, but some of it is literally like, I needed to find the time to turn on two-factor authentication in my build scripts, right? Like some of it is pretty basic, not so much skills gap as much as time and, or, filling out metadata. One of the things that's really interesting that is it's a little bit a TPS report style problem of every government on earth now says, oh, you need an SBOM. For those of you who are blessedly ignorant of our space, that means software bill of materials. It's literally the list of the things that is in there, right? And that's actually critical. Step one to defense in depth is, what am I defending? But that's also, in some sense, literally boring paperwork for maintainers to, even the ones who are more interested in security, convincing them to fill out that metadata it's a chore. That is definitely not what they got into open source for.
Yeah. I also, one of the ways I think about open source and security is sort of following how some of the security companies that I work with, think about their product development. And it usually starts with visibility. The first step, if you're a CISO, the first thing that you need to figure out is just what is the scope of the problem or what's the scope of the environment that I have. And then you can start figuring out about detection and response. Then you can start figuring out remediation, et cetera. And I feel that with open source and security, we're just barely still scratching the surface of the visibility stage, just knowing what is out there, how good is it. And SBOMs are, yes, they may be reminiscent of a TPS report, but I think, again, to me, they fall into this, minimum, hygiene of, what comprises the software that I'm using. And for the time being, SBOMs don't yet have any opinions about, is it good, is it bad, is it secure, is it insecure, do we know anything about these solo maintainers that created, are they based in North Korea, where are they? But I feel
are they failing to respond to emails because they're just distracted this week, or because they've thrown all their computers into a lake?
Exactly. But I think that is probably kind of the next stage of evolution of SBOMs, not just to be informative, but to start to become more opinionated and provide more information about okay, not only what's inside this, package, but again, provide more information about good, bad, indifferent, does it conform to NIST standards or not, et cetera.
Well, and that's, to put the Tidelift pitch very briefly, because we have a contractual relationship with the maintainers, our SBOMs do have information like that, right? We've reached out to people and we know, has this not been updated in the past year because it's basically done? Or has this been not updated in the past year because the maintainer's in jail? Sadly, not actually a hypothetical. We know they attest to us, are they following secure development framework practices? And we can surface that to our customers. That's the value exchange that we perform for our customers. So I couldn't agree more about the opinionated SBOMs being sort of that next step. Our moderator's trying to get in an edge.
Good eye. Just wanted to, Aeva, you mentioned a little bit about what CISA is doing. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is the role of the US government in securing open source?
So last year, we published our open source security roadmap, and that outlines what CISA's multi-year plan is for showing up and participating, not trying to tell open source communities what to do, but really just showing up and saying, hey, we're here to help. We're here to participate as a member of the open source community and work with them. To that end, we've published a number of guides. we developed a tabletop exercise, something that CISA does for a lot of other critical national infrastructure, where we go out and work with the infrastructure operators to run a simulated scenario of a really bad day or bad month. And we held a summit in DC, brought a bunch of open source foundations and security experts together back in March, ran that tabletop exercise, got some feedback, and we also ran it beginning of October, actually, in Denver with the Apache Foundation. The packet, the template, is published up on CISA's website. If anyone out there is an open source practitioner, maintainer, or consumer, you want to give it a try, we'd love to hear how it works for you. We published the bad practices guide. We also have a Secure by Design pledge we launched last year at RSA. And working with the Office of the National Cyber Director and others, had a request for input on how the US government as a whole should be engaging with the open source community. That launched a year ago at DEF CON, closed just before DEF CON this year. I was up there with Nazreen and Jordan from ONCD and DHS talking about the results. We had 120, I think, about 120 different responses to that. And, yeah, it's a lot of engagement.
Is the idea that...
Short answer, a lot of engagement.
Yeah. I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm just curious, how do you think about, do you think at some point the government needs to go even a step further and start regulating like open source in any shape or form, or mandating security requirements? Because for the time being, the government is doing very, very useful and necessary work of showing the light and shining a spotlight and providing guidelines of how you can secure open source projects. But at the end of the day, it's sort of like voluntary compliance. Like, if you want, it's up to maintainers or up to consumers, like what they do with that information. And I'm just genuinely curious, like how do you your personal... What I'm asking is that I have to say that I was really surprised when the president's executive order came out last year about securing software supply chain. And in my lifespan, I think this was the first time any presidential administration can opine on anything as geeky as software supply chain security. I was like, what? Yeah. And that's why that actually prompts my question.
So last year, 2023, the Office of the President put out the first national cybersecurity strategy, and it calls for shifting the balance, or shifting the burden of responsibility, rebalancing it from consumers, those who are consuming technology, to those who are more able to shoulder the burden of securing it. And in that same section, you will find a mention of open source, kind of geeky again, right, for the Office of the National Director, or National Cybersecurity Director, to say open source in the national strategy, but there it is. And the emphasis being not that open source developers would take that responsibility, but companies. Companies that are integrating open source need to be responsible consumers. They need to understand open source they're using, not just the name of the top level project, but all of the intermediary ones that have one or two maintainers. You have to understand what you're putting in a box if you're selling that to customers. So to shift that burden of responsibility to the integrators, and there may be ways to make that a little easier. Right now we're having some discussions around curation and the role of curators, whether that's a nonprofit foundation or a company, but are there ways to help balance this load so that individual maintainers are not shouldering that burden or that responsibility, but that it's not solely only on every single integrator who's then just duplicating work. What are the right ways to balance this? And yeah, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be individual maintainers who are like not aware of who's using their code liable for it.
At the same time, it's very easy. Well, I mean, actually, let me step back and say, the EU has already answered this question definitively, and like those regulations are coming. The Product Liability Directive and the Cyber Resilience Act, both of those were, the EU word for it, I believe, is adopted on October 12th. So by mid-2026 and mid-2027, between the PLD and the CRA respectively, software is going to be impacted by product liability rules. So if your software has anything to do with consumer safety, so if you're a car manufacturer, like the software in your car is now going to be treated in the EU as a product liability, just like any of the rest of your car, right?
Privacy, and the way it's written, it's digital goods, and that includes the service connected to the device.
Right.
So a smart device, the security of the cloud service that makes it run is in scope of the things that Louis was
Right.
talking
We've only got 14 minutes and 9 seconds left, so I cannot explain all the various ways in which those are going to impact the industry. But the very bottom line is both of those have carve-outs for open source, but nevertheless, some of those things are inevitably going to flow down. In some cases, I strongly suspect we'll see players like ChainGuard sort of aggregate some of that compliance work. That will be something that will benefit them, I have no doubt. But also some of it will be hard to do without working with maintainers. And so how that happens at scale is going to be interesting.
I just hope that these regulations are better written than GDPR.
Oh, I got bad news for you there, sorry.
Eva, I think in your earlier conversation, you referred to open source as a public good. Yeah, why do you think it's a public good, and what does that mean in practice?
In practice, what we've seen, and no study is perfect, but I think this study, the first of its kind, really shows the scale of this. Came out of Harvard earlier this year. Nagel and Joe were the two lead authors that I think there was a third one who I just forgot. Talking about the disparity between the supply side value generation and the demand side value. It's a 2,000 times difference. Right now, there's trillions of dollars in economic value created by open source around the world every year, not including Linux, because Linux is both the largest open source project, the most active maintained, and too big to measure, as they say. But
Doesn't include the web browsers either.
Oh, really?
Right, yeah.
Wow, yeah. So yeah, it's 8 trillion without including the biggest parts of it.
Yeah.
And that's enabled global digital transformation, not in a hyperbolic way. It really has. As Bogomil said earlier, somewhere around 95% of every commercial product uses open source. I've heard it said, don't quote me on the exact number, but every modern European car has something like 200 computers in it. They're all running open source, many of them. Like, it's everywhere. It's on the Mars rover. So that's...
Right.
Yeah.
And like a lot of our other public goods, we sometimes think about it very deeply, and other times we're like, oh, it's the air. How badly can we screw up the air? And yeah.
Yeah.
So if we accept that open source is a public good, who should pay for it?
I would like to think that the industry will get itself together to, I mean, look, like Bogomil said, there's going to be a lot of different layers of how we pay for it. Some of it's going to be VC funded. Some of it's going to be collectively industry funded, like Linux, the core Linux kernel, genuinely hundreds of people employed by hundreds of different companies, though there is a power law there as well of who employs those folks. I suspect at the end of the day, though, we don't rely on car companies to build our highways. I suspect government's going to have a significant role as well, right? I mean, we just can't. This $1 trillion number. I have this conversation about this HBS report, and people are like, "Oh, you misspoke. You meant billion, right?" It's like, no. Are tax funded, and I suspect in the longest run, you know, that might be 100 years, or it might be 5, I don't know, but I suspect at least some of it will be tax funded.
So we should pay taxes for it.
I don't know if you should pay taxes for it, but I think, as Eva just mentioned, I think a very powerful incentive is how the onus for securing open source, actually that burden is shifting on consumers, or like company, or let Eva call them integrators, like the people who integrate open source in their software. So through regulation and just honestly through like market expectations, I think these integrators of open source now have a powerful incentive to secure their consumption or their integration of open source, because at the end of the day, like they'll be the ones responsible for the holistic security of their products. And these integrators face relatively simple economic dilemma, right? So I either spend the time and money and resources like to fix vulnerabilities in whatever open source like I'm consuming. I either like need to do this myself, or I would channel some money, resources, time like to help the upstream maintainers of it open source like to do it for me. I mean, there's only two ways you can do this. Either you do it yourself, or you help the creators or the maintainers like to do it. And I think we'll see a mixture of both, right? Like we'll see for some kinds of open source projects or some packages, people making the choice to fix them themselves, and for others maybe like you buy a secured like hardened image from ChainGuard, or you work with Tidelift, etc. But I think there is so much momentum around kind of this very strong expectation that integrators or consumers of open source are responsible, and their hand is being forced like to do something about it. And just a very concrete example, I mean, for example, if you want to sell to the federal government as part of FedRAMP, you do need to show that whatever infrastructure you're running that is running government software like needs to have 0 non-vulnerabilities. And so things like that are actually like making their way slowly upstream to force people to do something about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I wonder, I think we're going to see some interesting challenges. The government example is a great one, because government purchasing power, as I'm sure everybody here knows, massive. It has a very clear idea of how you do change, which is like the first contract says you need to do X. That contract goes to a subcontractor who says you need to do X. So on and so forth to the, the provider of the screw that goes into the tank, or the concrete that goes into the highway. That last link is often broken in open source, right? Or just people don't even acknowledge that it exists. That's part of what we exist to do at Tidelift, is to close that last, is to add a contractual and commercial layer to that last step. So we partner a lot with government and with government contractors to help do this kind of thing. But that's a big, I think a lot of people just sort of take for granted that open source will magically solve that last step, and that's going to be a cultural change, an awareness change to make that last step happen.
What about something like the Open Source Pledge? Is that working? Is that a good idea?
Just imagine if every company who is using open source software, whether federal contractor or not, right, chose to be responsible about how they consume it to ensure their own longevity. They contribute back to make sure the project is healthy, to stay involved and ahead of CVEs when they come out, and that to ensure that their business, a year, 2 years, 5 years from now, isn't depending on a project that's no longer maintained because the maintainer won the lottery and walked away, threw their computers in a lake or something, right? Staying involved is how you maintain your product in the long term.
Yeah, and the question is, what's the form of that involvement, right? I mean, for those of you who are here in the building and not watching this on a stream later, you will have seen the giant billboards off the 101 for the OSS Pledge that is what you're mentioning. I've spent a lot of time on the boards of open source software nonprofits, and asking people, begging people, turning it into charity. I wish the OSS Pledge folks good luck. And I love that there are multiple people trying to come at this problem, but ultimately we founded Tidelift because we think a commercial relationship is more scalable.
Back to my point that, hey, there are no silver bullets, and I think the OSS Pledge is great. Is it a silver bullet? No, it's not. There are no silver bullets. But like any kind of initiative that would put billboards on highways, to raise awareness, kind of to bring focus on this, I think is really helpful. And just like when it comes to like big societal problems, there's nonprofits like have a role to play, and commercial companies have a role to play. I think this is kind of the same dynamics here at play.
The one thing just that I'd add to that, I think there's a perception in a lot of the industry that, oh, the Linux Foundation exists and is doing well. Like that, like there's sort of a perception that that solves the problem. And I just want to say, like, if you've ever believed that, that's not the case. Like that they are covering such a small chunk of the industry. We need, as you say, defense in depth, multiple approaches to this problem. So that's OSS Pledge, Linux Foundation, we're all in this mix, Tidelift, we're all in this mix together.
So where do we go from here? What are the next steps in practice? What do you see, where do you see the solutions going, I guess?
Two things jump out to me. Right, we've touched on SBOMs, we've touched on supply chain, but in terms of what to do actively, if you don't know what open source is in the components you're building or the components you're depending on, if you're integrating other companies' products into your products, chances are that they're using open source. If you don't know what's in it, you can't react when there is a CVE found or something like XZ happens. If you don't know what's in the box, you can't secure it. So it's your responsibility as builders to know what's in that box. We need better tools, we need better engagement to enable everybody to do that with less effort and less burden on individual volunteer maintainers and nonprofits. That's the big gap that I think a lot of folks are working on.
Any ideas? Any more ideas?
I mean, I think the answer to that problem depends so much on where you sit, right? Huge number of companies really should start exactly with what even am I doing? But then, and then once you get there, we're both going to see a lot of top-down governments pushing, okay, now you know what's there, start thinking about it. But, also bottom-up approaches. I would say the next question after that is, okay, think of all these packages in the middle of my stack that I've never heard of. Because every CTO has a strategy for their key components, right? Like they know, are we a Node shop or are we a Rails shop or a Java shop? They haven't thought about all those libraries, and you need to at least have a plan for thinking about what those things are and how you're supporting them.
I think the solution to open source security, at least to some degree, also needs to be open source. Like open source needs to help itself. And so I'm really hoping to see open source projects that are focused on open source security. I think we all agree that the biggest gaps or the biggest exposures come precisely from the long tail of solo maintainers, and they're the people who need the most help. They also happen to be the people who I think have a very strong bias, like to work with other open source technologies. And so it's almost like a call to action or an appeal, to open source creators and maintainers. I think all of these solo maintainers would really benefit from open source tools, technologies, harnesses, et cetera, to help them make it easier to scan the security of their open source project, to implement better security, to do peer reviews, with other solo open source maintainers. And so, at least part of the solution is going to be open source in my mind.
To that end, we have been working with MITRE on an open source tool to help maintainers, help consumer integrators, people who are using open source, to scan the projects and scan their dependencies, not for static vulnerabilities, but to analyze how was it developed, how active are the maintainers, not who are the maintainers, just how healthy is the project. Mm-hmm. And that tool is called HipCheck. It's up on GitHub. Folks are welcome to kick the tires on it. There's some ready-to-go Docker images to try.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also add that part of that is going to be cultural change as well, right? One thing that the government has said repeatedly is stop writing C.
Yes, and DARPA launched the tractor competition this summer at DEF CON. Right. This is a huge fund from DARPA for rewriting C into Rust using AI. So there's efforts like that. We just launched one with DHS Science and Technology. It's a $10 million-ish fund for software artifact dependency graphs, trying to go beyond SBOMs to something much more fine-grained in open source directly, right? It's not just build new startups, but also make this, by default, more secure in open source build tools, like Cargo for Rust.
Well, we are running out of time. So thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I hope now we have some better ideas and some ideas on how to go forward. Obviously, it's a huge problem, so we need support from everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all your time.
Thanks.